Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Apologies for the late start, but because of the very bad traffic outside, we had some late arrivals. I'm Gwen Robinson, the president of the Foreign Correspondents Club, and am here to moderate this fascinating discussion we've got lined up tonight. But first, I'd just like to flag up a couple of programs very interesting that we haven't yet got on our schedule. But next week on September the 11th, we will have a panel to discuss the situation in Hong Kong, hopefully with a couple of the people involved in the Hong Kong protests, as well as some analysts and others. So watch our website for the details of that, September the 11th. And the following week on September the 18th, we've got a very interesting one coming up on that will look at big power rivalry in Cambodia, triggered by the recent reports of Chinese military bases and the stepped up involvement of the US in Cambodia, threats of European Union sanctions on Cambodia. It should be a good night with some great experts, including Sebastian Strangio, who was the author of the Hun Sen biography, and Kawi Chong Kittavorn, the Bangkok Post columnist, and a couple of others. So keep those in mind. And also on next Monday, we have a fascinating documentary called Albatross, which is a film about basically the issue of plastics contamination and really close-up look at a community of albatrosses on an island. It's much more fascinating than it sounds. Sorry, I didn't mean to make it sound. It's a much acclaimed documentary and apparently very absorbing. So I recommend that. And then on September the 16th, one of our star former members, she is a member, Pylin Waddell, her award-winning documentary called Hope Frozen, about one family's saga, odyssey, to freeze their child who passed away. It's far more complex and fascinating than I'm making it sound, but it won some great accolades, and this would be one of the first screenings. It is limited to members only. Members are allowed to bring one guest, so I'm sure that if you're interested, there's an easy way in there. So that is September the 16th. So please look at our website for detail. And turning to the event at hand, as you know, we're looking tonight at the issue of what next for the Rohingyas. And you're very well aware, I think, of the situation. We've got nearly 1 million or more than 1 million, depending on how you count, Rohingya refugees sitting in Bangladesh on the border between Bangladesh and Myanmar. You've got a relative handful left in northern Rakhine State, mainly in Myanmar. And you've got a big push now for accountability, and also what really is a looming crisis about what do you do with 1 million stateless, homeless people. And to discuss it, here we have an excellent panel lineup, starting from the far right here, Jonathan Head from the BBC, who has just come back yesterday from a tour of northern Rakhine State and had a fascinating close-up on the ground look at the situation there, and he'll tell you more about it, but found many former Rohingya villages razed to the ground and other things. Next to him is Jessica Olney, who is an analyst and researcher working with the Asia Foundation and Centre for Peace and Justice at Brack University, with extensive experience on the border, Cox's Bazar area around the camps. Next to her is Shahnaz Ghazi, the Minister of the Embassy of Bangladesh in Thailand, who has very kindly agreed to join us tonight to give Bangladesh's point of view and discuss a little bit more about what the government in Dhaka is thinking or hoping for the near and medium-term future of the refugees. And next to her is Fiona Mcgregor, a well-known journalist to us all here, a very brave one who did extensive reporting in the early years of the Rohingya crackdown, was expelled from Myanmar for being one of the first to report about the extensive use of rape and human rights violations against the Rohingya, and then worked in the Cox's Bazar camps for aid agencies. And last but very not least, Kingsley Abbott, representative in Thailand for the International Commission for Jurists, who has been doing a lot of work on the accountability issue and can update us on where that stands now. So I think without further ado, Jonathan, you're going to kick off by putting us in the picture on what's happening on this side of the Bangladesh border with insights from Rakhine State.
Thank you very much, Gwen. I'm no expert on Rakhine, but we do get these occasional opportunities to go into a state that is effectively sealed off to journalists. The only way we can go these days is on a government-approved tour, and that's, you have to accept the limitations of that. It means you're in a convoy, you can't stop where you want, you can only talk to people that the government approves, and you can only go to places they want you to see. The BBC has often been, in effect, blacklisted from these trips. We don't always get on them. I know other colleagues have the same problem. We were fortunate that on this time they offered us a place on a trip that went in at the end of last week. The last time I was in Rakhine State was actually 2 years before. I got on a government trip that took place just a week and a half after the violence broke out in August. And although, again, it was a very controlled trip, we did manage to see a lot more than they wanted us to see, in particular the massive destruction of villages that was clearly recent, not, as they claimed, done by the Muslim Rohingya inhabitants themselves, and in fact watched one village being burnt down pretty much in front of our eyes. So it was very interesting for me to have a chance to go back after 2 years. What I'm going to do is play you a bit of video. Now, I'm kind of breaking both my own and my company's rules here, because you're going to see a bit of the BBC footage before it's gone out on the BBC, all in the confines of our club. But to give you a sense of what it's like, we will be putting out a report quite soon on the BBC. And the point I'm going to make, even with this very limited view we have, is despite the fact that the government clearly wants us to be sympathetic, and the message they want to get across in this is that Myanmar is ready to receive the Rohingyas back. There's a lot of international pressure on them. What we actually saw were places that we knew already from satellite imagery, camps, government facilities, installations that are being built on top of what were Rohingya villages. Rohingya villages are being, the best word to say use is obliterated. They are being wiped from the face of the earth. And in the video I'm going to show you, you'll get a sense of how we were able to see that. There are other reports based on satellite imagery that have drawn that conclusion. I was able to put that together with what we were able to see on this government convoy. And essentially, the interpretation I have is that Myanmar is not at all sincere about accepting back large numbers of Rohingyas. The conditions it's applying, where very few of them will be able to go back to their old lives because their villages just don't exist, mean that only small numbers would probably agree to go, with all their other issues about security and citizenship, and that if they do go back, mostly they would have to go back to specially constructed relocation camps where the Burmese authorities, the Myanmar authorities, can keep an eye on them. I'll just play a bit of video and I'll talk over it as I go. So this is on the road going up from the very southern tip of Mongdor, actually in Ratadong Township. This road is not open to anybody who doesn't have government approval. It's only recently been modernized. You don't have to take a boat anymore to get up to Mongdor. You can take this road. It's a lot faster, but ordinary people can't use it. Now, this is the border with Bangladesh. We were taken here because they want us to to show us that they are ready to receive Rohingyas back. This immigration official is showing us the lists of the last repatriation that was agreed with Bangladesh. Myanmar approved 3,450 of them, and so they're showing us here that they were ready to bring these people back, and they lined up the immigration officials who presumably only came in for us. I don't suppose they sit there all day long, and showed us all the procedures that they've got ready, including, they say, biometric details to process these Rohingyas. If significant numbers of Rohingya refugees do decide to come back here to Myanmar, this is where they're likely to spend at least their first 2 months. It's a transit camp, and as you can see, it's pretty basic. It's also fenced in with watchtowers and armed police. It's unlikely they'll be free to come and go. But there's something else about it that should worry Rohingya refugees. It was actually built on the site of what was an empty Rohingya village. In fact, dozens of Rohingya villages have continued to be demolished even after the violence, suggesting most of them will never be allowed to return to their old lives. Now that village is called, well, they've got other names, but the area is called La Po Kong, and it's the biggest transit centre where they can accommodate 25,000 returning refugees. This is what it was like back at the beginning of 2017. The villages on the north and south side of the road. This is in April 2018. You can see the village has totally disappeared. It was certainly burnt to some degree in the violence of 2017, and the beginnings of this camp are already, well, they're basically some of them visible. And then by the end of 2018, the camp is, let's just start again, the camp is pretty much complete. And that was the camp pretty much as I saw it.
Why did you destroy
this is the camp administrator
the village that was here to build this camp?
So he basically denied that any villages had been destroyed to make that particular camp.
But there was a village here, I've seen the pictures, it's disappeared and this camp is in its place. The satellite cannot lie.
So then he said, well, I only arrived here recently, I can't answer your question. This is a resettlement site. It's a place called Chen Chong, and it's where they expect large numbers, if Rohingyas do come back, after they've been in the transit camp, in theory, they can go back to their own villages. But in so many cases, their villages don't exist. They've been obliterated. So they would go to this camp. This camp is also, it's been constructed on top of a former Rohingya village that was demolished to make way for it. These houses are funded by Japan. They're actually quite good quality, certainly probably a lot better than where they're living now in Bangladesh. Other houses were funded by India and funded by the Myanmar government. But of course, if they live there, they will be under armed guard. Now this is a tracking shot that I took 2 years ago when we were coming into Mongdor. It's the first burnt village we saw. It's a village called Myotuji. If you look at it, you can see these are all burnt houses. We were there probably just a few days after they'd been set alight. This is the same view today, exactly the same place, same area. The village has completely vanished. In its place is a very large government and police complex. That up here, okay, I'll try and stop it just for a moment. So, the first view you see is, this is Myotuji as it was. This is it just after it's been burnt. It's this area up here you can see in the along the road there. The car I was traveling on was going down this road, so I could see it on my left hand side. That's where that filming was done. That film you saw of the village burnt was taken about 9 days before this satellite picture was taken on the 16th of September. So the village still existed then, and all those burnt buildings that you saw were still there. But as it goes on, you see the village has disappeared completely. They've started building, and then as they go on. This is perhaps... Now so Myotuji is a good example of a a village that has been totally obliterated and replaced by a very large government and police complex. Again, it's extraordinary, the contrast. You simply would never know there'd been a Rohingya village there. This is Indin. Now, most of you will know Indin because it's the reason why two very courageous Reuters journalists went to prison, because they managed to get not just accounts from refugees, but accounts from police, military, and local residents, Rakhine Buddhist residents, of a massacre of 10 Muslim men. Bizarrely, the government decided to take us there to show us that all was peaceful. I did this little piece to camera there. The strangest part of this tightly controlled government trip, they brought us to a village called Indin, which is notorious for a massacre of 10 Muslim men in September 2017, and for which two Reuters journalists went to prison after investigating it. Now, they brought us here, showing us scenes of ordinary life, to stress that it's all peaceful and harmonious now with the non-Muslim population. But if you come over here, behind this barbed wire fence is where the Muslims used to live. There's no trace of them now. They've constructed some kind of government barracks behind there, and it's quite clear that the Muslims are never coming back here. You know, this has been stated by people who've examined satellite footage, that, you know, this is quite clear from looking at the satellite footage that Rohingya villages are being completely wiped out. You would never know they'd been there. This is happening on a very large scale. And I think it's in that context we really need to understand what the Myanmar government's policy is. Officially, they're saying they're ready to take the Rohingyas back. But of course, they're not offering citizenship. They're not offering freedom of movement. And for most of the Rohingyas, the real fear is that if they did go back, they would end up, as you saw in that camp I showed you earlier, in a situation not too dissimilar from the 140,000 who are confined still to camps in central Rakhine State around Sitwe, where they've not been able to leave for 7 years since the communal violence of 2012. I think it's always worth going back to the statement that was made by the Myanmar Armed Forces commander right after the violence broke out in early September of 2017, when he stated that the military operation that his men were conducting in Rakhine State was fixing a problem, as he put it, left over from the Second World War. And basically that is something commonly echoed by Rakhine Buddhists, their belief that during the conflict in the Second World War in the 1940s, but when British and Japanese forces fought each other on what was almost the only active front line between those forces throughout the Second World War in the Pacific, and the front line shifted. There were population shifts. Muslims and Buddhists killed each other. They shifted. Buddhists fled south. Muslims fled north. But a common theme you hear from Rakhine Buddhists is that vast numbers of Muslims came over from what is today Bangladesh and populated, in particular, Mongdor, which was the only township in Myanmar that had a substantial Muslim majority. It was close to 90% Muslim up until the exodus of 2017. And after that exodus began, following the Myanmar military operation, Min Aung Hlaing himself said, "We are fixing a problem left over from 1942. The way they've fixed it is that because of the exodus, it's quite likely now the population of Mongdor is fairly evenly balanced between Buddhists and Muslims for the first time since the Second World War. And the Muslim population is quite scattered, obviously nervous, demoralized, cannot pose any kind of security threat, which is what they thought they saw as they became radicalized by ASA in 2016 and 17. So the likelihood that the Myanmar military would accept any large number of those Muslims who they've driven out back, it seems to me very small. And the conditions that they're applying, which is the eradication of Rohingya villages and the creation of guarded camps for those who might be courageous enough to come back, suggests they want to keep the population balance pretty much as it is today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Can we have the lights up, please? Thanks. That was an excellent insight into the situation in northern Myanmar. And we'll just leap across the border now over to Cox's Bazar with Jessica and your insights, Jessica, from on the ground. And hopefully we'll return to some of those thoughts from the Myanmar side as well. And Jessica, I think you've got also some slides.
Yeah.
Do you want the light off, or is it more like a map thing?
Is that okay? I think we can
Yeah,
keep the light on.
that's all right.
Everyone can see?
Yeah.
Okay. So just for those who may be a little less familiar with the context and the geography, we're talking about, you see where the red dot is with Chittagong? We're talking about that kind of southeastern part of Bangladesh along the Myanmar border. So now we'll go across the border just to the west of Myanmar, and this is kind of where everything's playing out in terms of the refugee response. So you can see it's kind of a peninsula, and we have the Naf River separating Myanmar and Bangladesh, and then the Bay of Bengal to the other side. So there are a total of, I think, 34 camps, encampments, including the mega camp, which is the image on the left, and then a smattering of smaller camps going down the peninsula. So a couple of these house registered refugees, who have been in Bangladesh since the early 90s, and the rest are the new arrivals, arriving mostly after October 2016. I think the mega camp alone houses more than 500,000 people. So you can see on the right that the camps are they don't constitute a dense proportion of the overall area, but when you consider the population, it's about, I think, 4 or 5 to 1 Rohingya to host community. So with that in mind, I wanted to start out by talking about some of our research about the host community and the host community's perceptions and experience with this response. So this research was conducted recently. Okay. This research was conducted earlier this year for UNDP by myself and my team at the Center for Peace and Justice at Prague University. So we wanted to dig in a little bit to how the host community is experiencing things, especially because we have rising social tensions between the refugee and host community population that we'll touch on a little bit later. But we found that the host community's main grievances are economic, of course. So one is falling wages. Rohingya are not permitted the right to work in the camps, which leads to a lot of people seeking labor jobs illegally, where they're undercutting the wages of the host community. And obviously this is a big grievance because they can charge a lot less, yet they receive aid, which the host community by and large does not receive. And at the same time, there's a rising cost of living. Some items are cheaper because of refugees' main source of livelihood is actually selling a portion of their aid every month to get a little bit of cash. So some prices are going down, like for rice or oil, but most other prices are going up because of the increased demand. And another thing that I think we didn't anticipate in our research was this sensation amongst people we talked to in the host community that the responses brought a large number of Bangladeshis from other parts of the country. This is a region with cultural and linguistic distinctions from Dhaka and kind of the center. So people felt that there's all these civil servants, police, military, and NGO workers from other parts of Bangladesh who are there to help the Rohingya and not the host community. Also, there's a humiliation that people have to cross checkpoints to go anywhere in their own community and prove that they're not a refugee. They're also losing access to natural resources. The refugee camps were built on government forest lands that have been largely deforested now. Also, education is being impacted because a lot of teachers from local schools have quit to work with education NGOs in the camps. You also have a very bad traffic situation, which might sound small in the grand picture, but it causes a lot of the daily frustrations. The road quality is quite terrible right now. And then, of course, security concerns is a major issue. But I point all this out with the understanding that overall, no one we talked to in the host community, we interviewed a couple hundred people, no one wanted the Rohingya to be forced back. They understand that that's not a viable option. There are a few kind of main agitators in the host community that are mobilizing people against the Rohingya. But most people we talked to, they said, we need our grievances to be addressed, but as long as those grievances are addressed, we can keep hosting them. We don't want them to be forced back. We also don't want them to be allowed to assimilate into the rest of Bangladesh. Kind of we'll help deal with this on behalf of our country. So this is a shot from the camps. I think over the last 2 years, we've seen the basic infrastructure and access to services really improve a lot. However, there's still there's not primary schooling or higher for refugee children. The Rohingya, as I said, don't have a right to work. So, a lot of people, I think, now are falling more into despair, realizing that this is going to become very protracted. There was a sense when I first arrived in October 2017, I felt that people were really eager to share their testimonies of what had happened in Myanmar, with sort of the sense that if the world knows what happened to us, then surely, change will come, the international community will come to intervene and make it better. And that hasn't happened, and I think refugees now are grappling with trying to understand why that is. So there's a loss of trust in NGOs, UN agencies, and the international community. So some of our other research is about Rohingya social organizing and how people are kind of dealing socially with this situation. So I have some images that show Rohingya outreach workers, like the guys on the right. They're educated Rohingya who are going and sharing information. It could be about health, it could be about education, it could be about protection, security issues, sharing it with other people. So a lot of NGOs and Rohingya themselves have organized in such a way for the educated, literate people to be sharing information and helping support the needs of the others. This is an image from last year on August 25th, which the Rohingya called Genocide Day. So this is a really powerful action by Rohingya university-aged youth where they all wore their Myanmar school uniforms and waved Myanmar flags. And they wanted to demonstrate that they have this more mainstream Myanmar identity, that they feel like they're a part of Myanmar, they grew up in the Myanmar education system, and they feel that that's part of their identity. I think, when you see the mass ability to mobilize, that comes across quite intimidating to the host community. So now there's some backlash from the second year Genocide Day commemoration that happened last week that you might have seen in the media. So it's kind of a catch-22 because on one hand, having Rohingya amplify their own voices is not only just and the right thing to do, but it also helps keep pressure on Myanmar. So they're Bangladesh's best allies in a sense in that way, yet face this backlash if they kind of organize too well from the host community. Normally, the advocacy that emerges in the camps is really directed against Myanmar, definitely calling for justice and accountability and rights. But sometimes we also see organizing to call for more rights within the camp setting. So this was from a demonstration earlier this year, calling for education, within Bangladesh for Rohingya youth. This is what was called the biggest gathering of Rohingya women ever last year on August 25th, and a lot of women came out to come together and share their stories. A lot of them, coming from a conservative culture, mostly stay at home, so it was quite powerful for them to come out and gather in this way, and they had another demonstration like this year. So we can see that the camp environment, as restrictive as it is, it's also been a chance for people to kind of come together in a way that they couldn't in Myanmar. Ironically, the freedom of movement is still restricted, but it's actually a bit broader than it was in Myanmar because they've been able to reunite with family members or friends that they couldn't visit in Myanmar for a long time because they couldn't move outside their villages. This is a photo of some educated women doing some mobilization activities in the community. We see women trying to promote literacy and teach other women, and a lot of women are asking for support to learn to write their names or develop basic literacy. So that's been one thing that's been emerging too. And there's also been international advocacy. So twice this year so far, the government of Bangladesh graciously permitted refugees to go abroad and participate in international advocacy. So this is Mohibullah, who's one of the kind of camp leaders, and the woman Hamida that are speaking at Human Rights Council. And later, Mohibullah and another youth leader went to DC recently for the Ministerial on Religious Freedom. And this is a gathering that Kingsley was also there for. Maybe he'll talk a little bit about this later, but this is an awareness-raising session to kind of check in with people about where the accountability process stands. And there can be very high expectations about if there is to be an ICC referral, kind of the change that might create in Myanmar, that justice would include conditions becoming good for repatriation. And so part of the process is about managing expectations that even if that justice process goes forward, it may have little bearing on domestic policy change within Myanmar. Yeah, that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica. I hope we can return to some of those issues as well. And then over to you, Ms. Shanazi Ghazi. Tell us the perspective of the Bangladesh government, and I think you have a statement from Dhaka as well.
Thank you very much. I don't have a statement from Dhaka, but this is a government position, and most of the things that I will say has been approved by our foreign ministry. So, distinguished friends and colleagues, good evening. On behalf of the Embassy of Bangladesh in Bangkok, I would like to thank Foreign Correspondents Club for arranging this panel discussion and for inviting me to talk about the situation of Rohingyas who took shelter in Bangladesh. So let me say a few words about the background. A few days back, a Rohingya friend of mine visited Bangladesh Embassy, and he was telling me that his grandfather and his relatives, they all held important positions in the Rakhine State a few decades back. But he does not have any citizenship. He does not have any right to pursue his studies beyond the school level. He does not have the right to travel. He does not have the right, no right as a citizen of Myanmar. So the Rohingyas, why I mention this, you all know that the Rohingyas have been living in Myanmar for generations, for hundreds of years. Once, as you know, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Myanmar, we were the same country under the British rule. The British rulers regularly conducted census every 10 years, and the last census was done in 1933. Even in those censuses in Burma, the Rohingya Muslim population in Arakan were mentioned. So if you examine the number and ratio of Muslim population in Myanmar, you'll see that the ratio of growth of these people, these Muslim people in Myanmar, is decreasing compared to the other races. That indicates that there has not been migration, fresh migration from our country in the recent times. Bangladesh got its independence in 1971. And our people, we are in an independent country. Our people have their rights. Our economic condition is much better than the condition in that part of Myanmar. And Bangladeshis have no reason to migrate to Myanmar illegally. So Myanmar's claim that the Rohingya people came from Bangladesh is totally baseless. Rohingyas are the residents of Myanmar. They are the denied citizens of Myanmar, and they have been described as the world's most persecuted minority. Since the 1970s, Rohingya refugees have been coming to Bangladesh from Myanmar. The first time the Rohingyas entered Bangladesh was during 1978 to 1979. Then during 1991 to 1992, in the 1990s, more than 250,000 Rohingyas took shelter in refugee camps in Bangladesh. In the early 20s, maybe 2001 or 2002, all but 20,000 of them were repatriated to Myanmar. Then fresh Rohingya influx started in 2017, exactly 2 years back. You all know the situation in Myanmar at that time that compelled these Rohingya people to flee their own country and take shelter in Bangladesh. At the moment, there are more than 1.1 million Rohingyas in Bangladesh, whereas only around 500,000 are in Myanmar. That means that the number of Rohingyas in Bangladesh are double than the Rohingyas in Myanmar. At the moment, there are a few Rohingya camps in Bangladesh, as my friend mentioned, around 34, right? A big number of Rohingyas are located along the Teknaf-Cox's Bazar highway that is parallel to the Naf River, which is the border between Bangladesh and Myanmar. Most of the refugees are located in or near Cox's Bazar, a coastal area dependent upon tourism. The most well-known Rohingya camp in Bangladesh is called Kutupalong, where Rohingyas who came earlier have been living. After this camp became overcrowded, especially after 2017 Rohingya influx, Rohingyas are living in an extension camp which is called Mega Camp. There are a few more camps called Naya Paral, Leda, etc. The Rohingyas are living in temporary shelters and are receiving basic help like security, food, health facilities, etc. There are more than 1,200 informal learning centers or schools that are providing education up to primary level to the Rohingya children. UNICEF and local and international NGOs are operating those informal schools. Dear friends, as you are aware, Bangladesh government has been requesting Myanmar to take back the Rohingya people. Bangladesh concluded 3 bilateral instruments with Myanmar on repatriation of the forcibly displaced Rohingyas currently sheltered in Bangladesh. According to bilateral instruments, the repatriation was scheduled to commence in January 2018 with a target to complete process in next 2 years. But regrettably, the physical repatriation is yet to begin. After the abortive effort on 15th November last year, another repatriation attempt was made on 22nd of August 2019 with a fresh list of 3,450 Rohingya individuals out of 1.1 million verified by Myanmar. We agreed to facilitate the commencement of repatriation on 22nd August in the backdrop of Myanmar's repeated claim that they are prepared to receive the displaced persons, and the visit of a high-level delegation from Myanmar at camps in Cox's Bazar in July 2019 to convince the displaced people to return. But regrettably, Myanmar failed to dispel the trust deficit between Myanmar government and their displaced people. During the recent interactions with the high-level delegations from Myanmar led by Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in July 2019, the representatives of the displaced Myanmar residents called for international civilian monitors' presence in northern Rakhine to guarantee security and to monitor the repatriation and reintegration process. Myanmar delegation also agreed to continue dialogues with the displaced people at frequent intervals to find mutually acceptable solutions at the earliest possible on core issues including granting of fundamental rights and citizenship. Rohingyas sheltered in Bangladesh expressed utter dismay that Myanmar delegation was unable to report any progress concerning citizenship rights and security issues for their return to northern Rakhine. Dear friends, Myanmar's Ministry of Foreign Affairs hurriedly issued a press release on 22nd August 2019 accusing Bangladesh of not being able to send their people due to alleged non-compliance with the bilateral instrument. As per bilateral instrument on repatriation, the responsibility of encouraging the displaced people to opt for voluntary return lies entirely on Myanmar. It is Myanmar's responsibility to create a conducive environment in Rakhine through actions and to reduce trust deficit of Rohingyas through appropriate measures, including dissemination of authentic information on the ground reality. The non-commencement of repatriation due to unwillingness of the people concerned is fully attributed to the failure of the government of Myanmar in fulfilling its obligations. In fact, the government of Myanmar needs to take actions with demonstrable political will to reasonably address the core concerns of the Rohingyas in line with the spirit of provisions of the bilateral instruments on repatriation and recommendation of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State in order to create a conducive environment for return in northern Rakhine. The government of Myanmar must also assume its responsibility to encourage Rohingyas to opt for voluntary return by sharing correct information with them in all possible ways. Unsubstantiated claims without proven evidence on the part of the government of Myanmar are not going to contribute to the commencement of repatriation. Instead of fulfilling its own obligation, Myanmar still continues playing the blame game and misleading the international community with fabricated information and misinterpretation of facts, as you have already seen in the documentary. As our Honorable Foreign Minister mentioned in a briefing to the diplomats based in Dhaka recently, Myanmar Union Minister for the Office of the State Councillor, Mr. Chaw Tin Sue, reportedly told the Russian Foreign Minister at a bilateral meeting in Moscow in June 2019 that the root cause of the issue in Rakhine is the illegal migration of 500,000 Bangladeshis to Myanmar after 1975, which is a lie. Also, during the 52nd ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting and subsequent ARF meeting in Bangkok a few weeks ago, Myanmar Union Minister Mr. Chaw Tin mentioned that the Rohingya crisis is an issue with deep-rooted history involving irregular cross-border migration, as there had been 3 waves of illegal mass migration into Myanmar since the time of colonial period, and it is therefore imperative to solve this issue bilaterally. Mr. Tin further refuted that the number of displaced persons claimed by Bangladesh as 1.2 million is too much inflated and have to be verified and confirmed. This was not the first time Myanmar contesting the widely accepted figure of displaced Rohingya taking temporary shelter in Bangladesh. In fact, Bangladesh is witnessing such ill-motivated statements from Myanmar side for quite some time. As far as the nationality of the Rohingyas is concerned, there cannot be any confusion. In the bilateral instruments on return, Myanmar has recognized them as Myanmar residents, although Myanmar still refuses to allow them citizenship. Such statements clearly indicate that Myanmar still pursues the policy of exclusion and marginalization of its ethnic minorities. Myanmar often tries to give an impression that Bangladesh is not allowing or facilitating the repatriation. Our government reassures that the government of Bangladesh maintains its principled position of not preventing anyone, regardless of ethnic and religious identity, who intends to return to Myanmar anytime. The government of Bangladesh always stands ready to extend all possible cooperation to those who volunteer to return. Sincerity of Bangladesh in facilitating earliest repatriation of Myanmar residents has been unquestionably established through its actions. Thousands of both national and international media are monitoring it on a day-to-day basis. Myanmar may also allow global media and UN agencies, as Bangladesh did, to monitor and report on Myanmar's readiness in receiving their displaced people. Bangladesh feels that Myanmar's failure to effectively dismantle the IDP camps in Rakhine and resettle the camp dwellers to a place of their original residence or places of their choice, as well as taking back the people sheltered at the international boundary or zero line, is a clear manifestation of lack of will on part of Myanmar to repatriate and integrate these persecuted people. Needless to mention that such initiatives require no involvement of the government of Bangladesh. Bangladesh feels that accusing Bangladesh of non-cooperation in the repatriation effort by a party who is fully responsible for the crisis is baseless, ill-motivated, and totally unacceptable. Bangladesh has urged the government of Myanmar to fully concentrate on the implementation implementation of its obligation and commitment necessary for a durable solution of the problem. We feel that the government of Myanmar should seriously consider a comprehensive engagement of the international community in creating an environment conducive for their return, as well as in monitoring the repatriation and reintegration process in Myanmar. Dear friends, today was a working day. After a long day, we all want to go back home, because home is a place where memories are made, where you have your friends, you have your family members. Home is a place where you have peace. While we are talking about Rohingyas, 1.1 million Rohingyas are spending facing uncertainty back in my country, Bangladesh. We urge the international community and everybody to convince Myanmar to help Myanmar so that they take back their citizens, so that they take back their people and find out a permanent solution to this problem. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Shahnaz. I think also what people in this room would like to know very much, apart from the actual politics of this situation, as you have pointed out, is that you do have a crisis that is getting worse now with the increased number and the circumstances we've heard about in the camp. So I think probably the question would be, we've had a lot of reports about your government's proposals or plans to relocate some of the refugees. Perhaps one plan is on the island where you've built some new facilities, and also clearly the camps in Cox's Bazar are very crowded. So perhaps either now or maybe later, or now if you've got a quick answer to that. I know that we had discussed that, and you might throw some light on where are things at in terms of the logistics right now of the camps and what you can do.
Thank you. Bangladesh government planned for establishing the Bhasanchar camps
on the island.
On an island, because there was a possibility that 10% of the Rohingya camps where they are living, they will be that area will be underwater. So Bangladesh government thought of some kind of arrangement so that Rohingyas can be shifted to that place. So accordingly, in the last 2 years, Bangladesh built some permanent camps, permanent buildings in a place, in an island called Bhasanchar. So at the moment, there are lots of negative propaganda about this char. Just because it's an island, it does not mean that it's a bad place and we want people to drown or to shift them to some inhabitable place or something like that. It's not that. It's a very planned city type of area where there are mosques, there are good houses. Those are much better than the camps where the Rohingyas are living. There are schools, there are hospitals, and all kinds of facilities. So just because it's an island, that doesn't mean that it's a bad place. And Bangladesh government and the Bangladeshis people, we are sympathetic to our neighbors, the Rohingyas, as you all already know. So we will not do anything. I'm sure we will not do anything that will, make their position more difficult. Just because we have many resorts on islands. Not all islands are bad. And we will, of course, we will take care of their security and also cyclones and everything.
Thank you. I think your foreign minister recently reiterated that it would go ahead, but so far there's been a huge delay.
You see, as a host country, look at us. It's so much crowded, overcrowded. Our country is a densely populated country. We don't have space for extra people. But I mean, many countries are building shelters and camps and different places. That doesn't mean that we are just shifting the people to a place where they will live in like miserable condition. It's not that. I mean, the whole world is monitoring. We will not send them anywhere that they will face problems.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think that means the plan is very much still on. But anyway, maybe we can come back to that. Over to you, Fiona. Your rather diverse experience of the situation, both sides of the border.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, this event this evening is happening at a really critical moment when it comes to looking at the future for the Rohingya. I think, you know, before going further, I think it's really important to acknowledge the way in which the Bangladeshi government, and particularly the local people in Cox's Bazar that Jess mentioned, you know, welcomed the Rohingya at the height of the crisis in 2017 was remarkable, and, you know, it set a good example. I also think it's really important to acknowledge the great work done by the UN agencies, other humanitarian actors in adapting what was really an absolutely horrific situation on the ground. When these refugees, you know, first started arriving, you know, people were, you know, they were sleeping outdoors. There was no food. You know, the hygiene conditions were absolutely horrendous. You know, and now there's a situation where there's a settlement with roughly 1 million people, all of whom have access to, you know, basic accommodation, to basic food rations, and to healthcare. So that is an improvement. But, you know, we're 2 years on from this now, and I think the time has come. There really needs to be an urgent review, both by Bangladesh, I think, and the UN and other agencies supporting the crisis, to make sure that they don't become complicit in the ongoing persecution of the Rohingya in ways which are becoming disturbingly reminiscent, really, of what people faced in Myanmar. Now, I don't think conditions are as bad as they are in Myanmar. Even arriving in the height of the crisis, you know, when things were so bad, there was still a sense that people were safer there. But, you know, we have to be realistic. Right now, in the camps, you know, Rohingya people are denied freedom of movement. They're denied the right to work. They're denied the right to education. They're forced to live in accommodation that is pretty flimsy because there's restrictions on building longer-term accommodation for people. And even despite all the great things, you know, that Jess illustrated with her slides there, the great work that are being done by agencies and, you know, government to try and make things better, it's still a terrible place to live. It's one of the most, you know, overcrowded places in the world. It's hit by some of the worst monsoon conditions, you know, there, and people don't have any options. On top of that, as Jess mentioned, there's increasing tensions with the local communities, and while she very rightly outlined, you know, some very genuine reasons, you know, this has had a huge impact on the lives of local people, and there's no denying that. But it's also being deliberately stirred up by political actors in the area, and, you know, and that's stoking resentment, it's stoking fear, and that's leading to sometimes violent protests by the local community as well. So it's not a good situation when you have, you know, a large population with restricted movements, and there are people deliberately, you know, stoking up the tensions in the area around that. As just discussed, there's also plans to send refugees to the Basan Char. I think the UN's position has been so far that they don't know exactly enough to be able to support it one way or the other. But I think, you know, from what I'm hearing, there's a lot of pressure being put on UN agencies to agree to this. You know, basically, I've heard that they've been told that if they don't support the move to Basan Char, the government's going to be very reluctant to engage in their funding appeal next year. So that's the kind of pressure that they're coming under. There's also talks about fencing in some of the camps. Both of these conditions, you know, as you said, an island in itself is not necessarily a bad a problem, but an island that's so far away that people are hours from help, that sometimes even when I think the government's tried to take delegates to show them conditions, they haven't been able to do that because weather conditions have been too bad to reach people. It shows how isolated that is. And another thing, you know, that's of concern right this week is that following the recent attempt to repatriate people again, which the Rohingya, no Rohingya agreed to go back, I think perhaps for reasons that Jonathan's fairly well outlined. And also, as Jess highlighted, the event to mark the second anniversary of August 25th, which was the start of the big exodus in 2017, that the Bangladeshi government has responded very negatively to that. We've seen the refugee commissioner has been moved from his post. Now, he was a man who was recognized as being you know, a good supporter of the humanitarian response and sometimes standing up for refugee rights when there was perhaps political moves that you know, that were threatening things, particularly in the first repatriation attempts back in 2000 last year. But on top of that, the people that took part in this protest, some of the leaders, you know, they're being called in for interrogations, and I think I've also know of at least one international NGO representative who was told to leave Cox's Bazar because the government is concerned about this show of power, of political power by the Rohingya, even though, you know, what happened, you know, it was a peaceful protest and it was a commemoration. It's caused a lot of stir. We're also hearing now about attempts to restrict phone communications in the camps, you know, and that's obviously a way that people rely on very much for getting vital information and, of course, for contacting, you know, relations and friends. So, I think looking forward to, you know, what next for the Rohingya, there's some key issues that really have to be addressed. And I think the first one of those is the international community and Bangladesh has to stop perpetuating the myth that the Rohingya can safely go back any time in the future. You know, it's not being said enough. Everybody acknowledges it behind the scenes, but until people are open about that, we can't come up with realistic alternatives. I think secondly, once that's recognized, I think the UN and the international community needs to work properly with Bangladesh to find ways that Bangladesh can be compensated, you know, and supported in keeping Rohingya, you know, in the country for a longer time, whilst making sure that any agreement or any plans that are put in place to do that ensure that the Rohingyas' human rights are properly recognized, because as I've just outlined, at the moment they're not. Lack of freedom of movement, lack of chance to work or educate, you know, these rights are not being respected. So, you know, that needs to be enshrined. But that's not to say that Bangladesh should be left to do this on its own. And I think it's, you know, just to underscore that this is not Bangladesh's fault that led to the refugees being there in the first place. You know, that firmly lies in the hands of Myanmar. But if we have to recognize that nothing has changed in Myanmar. The same people that enacted a deliberate policy to push this community out of Myanmar in the most violent way is still there and aren't acknowledging that they've done anything wrong. You know, it's totally unrealistic to expect people to go back. So we need to be looking at alternative options for the population. And you know, the Rohingya population needs to be brought into these discussions, something other than the choices basically people are facing at the moment, which is go back to an open-air prison in Rakhine or stay in what is effectively an open-air prison in Bangladesh. That is not a valid choice, and the international community needs to be better in putting alternative options out there. And I think that, you know, of course the Rohingya are right to demand that the world keep supporting their rights to go home. And, you know, there does need to be continued pressure put on Myanmar, but that doesn't mean that international actors shouldn't also be doing everything possible to ensure that Rohingya people in the meantime are able to live lives in which their humanity and rights are respected. And I find it, to be honest, profoundly depressing to be outlining here the same restrictions you know, that are happening in Rohingya rights in Bangladesh, as I was reporting on 6 years ago in Myanmar. You know, something is not right with that. And I think it's really unfortunate that and worrying that the UN in particular hasn't been a bit more vocal in challenging these restrictions. You know, I don't think it serves Bangladesh to allow the country to undermine the global recognition it got for its excellent response in the beginning by letting refugees in, but now ignoring and not challenging the policies that are ongoing that continue to deny people their rights. So, you know, yes, you know, this is a time of political sensitivity around refugees everywhere in the world. This is not just Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is certainly not the worst country when it comes to supporting refugees. But that doesn't mean that that things should be allowed to carry on as the way they're going. And the UN has a responsibility to call people to account, you know, because in 2013 and 14 in Myanmar, the humanitarian response in central Rakhine, the people that were displaced during the 2012 violence, were being kept in camps, and the UN people running those camps then or supporting those camps then, you know, they expressed their concern about what was happening there. They expressed concerns that they were in effect supporting prison camps that laterally turned into, I think, what it would be fair to call concentration camps. And I think, you know, there was various reasons that happened. I don't think people could necessarily have predicted that these settlements were going to end up still being there 6 years later, 7 years later. But we can't have another situation. There's no excuse going forward in Bangladesh for the international community to be supporting yet another set of lifelong prison camps for you know, for refugees and displaced people to be caught up into. You know, allowing human rights to take a back seat for diplomatic reasons in Rakhine didn't end in a resolution. It concluded with genocide, and the UN agencies lost most of the access that they'd had to northern Rakhine. That was the thing that they had, were saying they weren't speaking out to defend that access. So, it's not a successful policy, and I one would hope that at least some lessons have been learned from that. But, to be clear again, no one is suggesting Bangladesh should be left to resolve this situation on its own. This is, it's an unusual refugee crisis. It's one that's arisen out of genocide. Thankfully, that's not something that happens very often. And, Bangladesh has let people into the country. So how can they be supported going forward? Unfortunately, we don't have time right at the moment to brainstorm all the different alternatives to forcing the Rohingya to stay in camps. But I think it's worth noting that Bangladesh is in the top 5 countries in the world for immigrant working populations, and that I think UN figures are slightly different. I've seen somewhere between 7.5 to 12 million Bangladeshis working abroad. They send in the remittances from that amount to $15 billion a year into the Bangladeshi economy. I know that you mentioned 1 million Rohingya refugees are a lot to take in a country that has a big population on a small landmass. But I believe 1 million Bangladeshis sought work in other countries in the same year. So I think there's room for support and negotiation there. A lot of Bangladeshis who go away to work are a lot of people do it legitimately, but a lot are also taken advantage of by brokers or persuaded to take, risks. A lot of to get to Europe. We hear about a lot of migrants, dying en route to en route to Europe. I think there's room for some kind of pro rata arrangements with Bangladesh, to recognise if they can give perhaps working rights to some of the Rohingya, the Bangladeshis can be supported to have access to work and an education through safe methods abroad. That's just one idea.
And Fiona, I think that we can, maybe Kingsley will also address some of the issues of the earlier thing you touched on about accountability and things. But what also might be useful is, with your extensive experience and also Jessica's living in the camps and working with the people, about the sentiment on the ground, about, where, the sense that you got over a couple of years working with them, where they actually, want to be. Clearly not going back somewhere where they're going to be treated, as bad or worse than before, or in concentration camps, but also they're not, entirely happy where they are. So given the various priorities, and there's also some anger mounting about the push for accountability, what is your sense of working on the ground with these people, and the vast majority, do they want to actually go back or not? If the circumstances are right, do they actually want to go back, or, what's the future? What's your sense of how they feel? Yeah,
I think, of course, people want to go back, as you mentioned, it's their home, but they want to go back when conditions are right, and it's abundantly clear that they're not. And the point is, they're not being given any option in the meantime, and that's what I'm saying, Rohingya people need to be involved in discussions about what the options are, other than being trapped in a camp in Bangladesh or trapped in a camp in Rakhine. And those options aren't on the table at the moment.
Okay, well, thanks. We'll come back to that, I think. And lastly, turn to Kingsley. I think you also had some on-the-ground interaction recently.
Thank you very much, Gwen, and good evening, everybody. My name's Kingsley. I'm responsible for the ICJ's work on accountability, and so I'd like to tonight just update you all a little bit on where we are at with respect to the issue of accountability for what's taken place in Myanmar and what's ongoing. And I think it's first important to begin by saying that the issue of accountability isn't the only issue, as we've heard tonight. There are pressing issues with respect to repatriation, humanitarian assistance, issues around citizenship, the need for legal reform in Myanmar, and so on. But when we talk about accountability, we're talking about accountability for serious human rights violations that, in the context of Myanmar and now carried over into Bangladesh, could amount to international crimes, including potentially crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. And if we take a snapshot of the position we were at the beginning of last year with respect to accountability, the prospects seem to be very grim, very desperate. Myanmar fell into a category of situations where there were no genuine domestic efforts to conduct investigations or carry out prosecutions that met international law and standards for serious human rights violations in the country. Secondly, Myanmar is not and is still not a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, so their hands look to be tied. In situations like in Myanmar, this is where the UN Security Council is meant to step in and refer the situation to the International Criminal Court. And that hadn't happened and still has not happened and should happen. And lastly, countries around the world which exercise what we call universal jurisdiction, where they can investigate and arrest and prosecute people for certain categories of crimes that take place in other countries around the world, were unable to do so because they didn't have the evidence or the information, and people of interest may not have been travelling through their jurisdictions. So it was desperate. But since then, particularly towards the end of last year, there have been some developments on the accountability front. And I want to emphasise that it's still not enough, but it is progress. And I think it's important also to emphasise that all of these international efforts at accountability are only in motion because Myanmar thus far has failed to exercise its obligations to itself carry out investigations and prosecutions that meet international law and standards. Were Myanmar to do that, then the international community and some of these mechanisms I'm going to talk about wouldn't have any interest in Myanmar. For example, when I talk about the International Criminal Court, it's important to recall that the International Criminal Court is a court of last resort. It only comes into motion very reluctantly in cases where there isn't accountability efforts being made on the ground. So let's look at, first of all, accountability efforts on the ground very briefly. First of all, we haven't seen open, transparent investigations and prosecutions that meet international standards into any of these human rights violations that have been alleged. What we have seen have been some apparent prosecutions that we are not fully aware of the detail of in some military courts with respect to the Indin alleged crimes. We heard that some officers and some military personnel were prosecuted in military courts and sentenced to 10 years. But we also learned later that these persons had apparently served less than a 1-year sentence before they were released. And then just on Saturday, a few days ago, there was an announcement by the Myanmar government in brief on its website that there will be further court-martials with respect to other incidents that occurred in Rakhine in accordance with the military discipline due to the weakness in following the instructions of some of the incidents at a certain village. So the court-martial will proceed in accordance with the procedures of military justice, and no further information is available. And this raises all kinds of issues. This isn't enough. I mean, first of all, allegations of serious human rights violations should never be prosecuted in a military court. These are solely of the concern of civilian justice systems. And there isn't any transparency around these investigations and prosecutions. Secondly, very briefly, some of you will be aware of the ICOE, the International Commission of Inquiry for Myanmar, that was established recently. And the ICOE has a mandate to investigate the allegations of human rights violations and related issues following terrorist attacks by ASA with a view to assigning accountability for any human rights violations and related issues that may have occurred. And it's made up of 4 members, 2 Myanmar nationals, a Japanese ambassador, and a Filipino ambassador. And there are real concerns about the ICOE. Having carefully assessed its mandate and looking at the way in which it is intending to carry out its work, it can be concluded that it can't be seen as of having any likelihood of being independent, impartial, or making an effective contribution to justice or accountability. And just some examples. The spokesperson for the Office of the President said, "We have formed the Independent Commission of Inquiry to respond to false allegations made by the UN agencies and other international communities." And the chairperson of the ICOE stated at a press conference that there will be no blaming of anybody, no finger pointing of anybody, saying that you are accountable. So this already raises enormous concerns. The International Commission of Jurists also wrote a letter to the ICOE some time back asking about what processes it has in place for the collection of information, for the security of witnesses, for the safety of people that cooperate with the ICOE, and there simply just wasn't a response, and there remains no transparency around its operations. So I would now just like to touch briefly on some of the international accountability efforts that are underway, and then we can have a Q&A afterwards if anyone is interested in knowing more. But there are really 5 key international accountability efforts that are all in motion at the moment. The first is some really important work that's being done by civil society, national civil society, regional civil society, and international civil society. Organizations like Human Rights Watch, Fortify Rights, Amnesty International, to document crimes that allegedly occurred in Myanmar and have carried over into Bangladesh. also the work of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And then in March 2017, the Human Rights Council created something called the UN Fact-Finding Mission, which some of you will have heard of. And that did some fantastic work in documenting to a human rights standard, which is to a low evidential standard, crimes that were allegedly committed in Rakhine, Kachin and Shan, and recommending that, such as the gravity of the apparent offending, there needed to be further investigations throughout the whole country. And the fact-finding mission actually concludes its work this month in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, where it provides its final report. The fact-finding mission in September last year recommended the creation of another mechanism, a special mechanism, which is quite new to international justice, called the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, the IIMM. And that has quite a different mandate to the fact-finding mission, because it is tasked with conducting investigations to a criminal trial standard in Myanmar for any serious human rights violations that occurred since 2011. And that mechanism has just come online as of August this year and is providing its first report to the Human Rights Council on Monday. And they won't be staffing up with only human rights experts. They will be staffing up with international criminal lawyers who may have experience at the former tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, who are experienced in carrying out international criminal investigations. It doesn't have a court, though. It is really an investigative body that will store evidence in a repository and then will share it with any processes that in the future attain jurisdiction to conduct prosecutions. And that might be the International Criminal Court, but it might also be countries willing to exercise universal jurisdiction, like I mentioned before. We've seen countries like France and Germany and Switzerland and others where persons of interest who pass through their jurisdictions, even though they may have committed international crimes in other parts of the world, they might be arrested and prosecuted in those jurisdictions. The next mechanism, which came online last year, somewhat unexpectedly, I have to say, is the International Criminal Court, which you're all familiar with. How and why did it come online when Myanmar is not a party to the Rome Statute? Well, there was a legal ruling saying that although Myanmar is not a party to the Rome Statute, Bangladesh is a party to the Rome Statute. And some of these crimes that were allegedly committed inside Myanmar carried over across the border into Bangladesh. And Bangladesh, being a party to the Rome Statute, therefore has an engagement with the International Criminal Court. Now, it is only looking at those categories of crimes that have a cross-border element. Those include crimes against humanity of deportation, the forcible transfer of people across a border in the context of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population, persecution, and other inhumane acts. But that's not to say that it will be as narrowly focused as that in practical terms, because the International Criminal Court, if it moves to a full investigation, will also be looking at the underlying causes for that deportation, those persecutory acts throughout Myanmar. It will also have to investigate whether there was a widespread or systematic attack inside Myanmar. So it in fact is likely to be an expansive investigation. Importantly, in terms of developments, the procedure at the International Criminal Court, when the prosecutor herself decides to launch an investigation, like what happened here, is that an investigation is not automatic. She has to first conduct what's called a preliminary examination, which she has now done, which is an assessment as to whether or not the technical requirements of the Rome Statute are met. And then the prosecutor applies to the International Criminal Court for authorization to conduct a full investigation. That application was made just a few weeks ago and is now pending, and it's quite possible that within the next few months, perhaps by the end of the year or early next year, the International Criminal Court will authorize that investigation. And in those circumstances, we're in an entirely new chapter with respect to potential avenues for accountability, because there will be a full International Criminal Court investigation with all the resources into at least those crimes with a cross-border element. The last point I'll touch on is that there's been some discussion in the media around the possibility of referring Myanmar to the International Court of Justice, which is not a criminal mechanism, the ICJ. It is known as the UN Court. It's created by the UN Charter. It has its seat in The Hague, something called the Peace Palace, and it has two real categories of jurisdiction. The first is what's called its contentious jurisdiction, where there's a dispute between two states that it settles, and the other is where it provides what's called advisory opinions on matters of international law. Now, there has been some talk that Gambia is thinking about bringing a case against Myanmar before the International Court of Justice, and there have also been discussions about other states maybe doing the same. Why? If it's not a criminal court, if it cannot find individual criminal responsibility like the ICC doesn't focus on whether or not Myanmar committed a crime. It will zero in on whether particular identified individuals committed crimes. So why the ICJ? Well, there has been a ruling under international law that a state itself can be found to be responsible for genocide under the Genocide Convention. And Myanmar has ratified the Genocide Convention. And so there is precedent in the past in cases where Croatia brought cases against Serbia, Bosnia brought cases against Serbia, where there can be a hearing at the International Court of Justice as to whether or not a state, in this case Myanmar, has violated its obligations under the Genocide Convention, whether it has committed genocide itself. But that is usually a very long process, and in those cases I mentioned with respect to Serbia, they already had a large body of evidence and judicial findings by the International Court investigating and prosecuting the former Yugoslavia. In the case of Myanmar, there isn't yet that corpus of information or evidence. So I'll finish by saying, well, what is needed now? All of these mechanisms require state cooperation. For example, the International Criminal Court doesn't have its own police force. It requires states to facilitate arrests. It requires states to provide information. It requires states to resource the International Criminal Court and provide it with diplomatic and political support. And that should be something that we should be looking for from ASEAN as well, because this situation has regional significance. There needs to be ongoing support at the Security Council for a full referral of all alleged crimes within Myanmar to the International Criminal Court. And there needs to be support for countries willing to exercise universal jurisdiction. If, for example, the IIMM develops a library of evidence that international crimes have been committed, and that's an if, then states need to be willing to take that information and initiate investigations and prosecutions in their own jurisdictions. And I think lastly, just to touch on the point that Jessica raised when she mentioned the discussions that are going on in the refugee camps around these accountability mechanisms, is one of the huge and very valid criticisms of all of this is that these mechanisms seem to be very remote. They're often seated in faraway countries, somewhere in the north. They might be investigating crimes that were committed in the global south, in this case allegedly in Myanmar and Bangladesh. But how do we bridge the gap between their work and the victims on the ground? And in order for the victims, in this case the Rohingya people in Bangladesh, but also other minorities throughout Myanmar, how do we bridge the gap between those mechanisms and those victim groups? And there needs to be more done. As Jess mentioned, when you go and talk to the Rohingya within the camps, those who are the direct victims of these alleged crimes, they themselves are finding it very difficult to differentiate between the IIMM, the FFM, the ICC, the ICJ, and you know, sometimes it's assumed that I'm a judge from the ICC or I'm a judge from the ICJ, this kind of thing. We need to do better in what we call outreach, where once these mechanisms start building up their momentum, if there is a full investigation by the ICC, once the IIMM starts its operations, there needs to be real thought given to how to touch the ground here in Bangladesh and still hopefully in Myanmar, although Myanmar is not cooperating thus far with any of these mechanisms, so that those victims have a real sense of agency, a sense of understanding, and able to give their informed consent to cooperate and maybe provide information to these mechanisms, or not, as is their choice. So I'm happy to take some questions a little bit later on, but that's a quick snapshot of where we're at on the domestic and international accountability front. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kingsley. You drew that issue really well, and hopefully we'll return to that. So we've got a bit of time for some questions. We started half an hour late, so we'll run this for another 20 minutes or half an hour if anyone wants to ask a question. But I would just leave the panellists as what I think you've all drawn really well is that, you know, there is so many issues, but they broadly boil down to one aspect, which is the accountability issue and all the international work that's being done on that, and versus the logistical, practical issue, which is becoming increasingly urgent, although it looks like we're getting through this rainy season without some massive, tragic monsoon, cyclone, whatever. But that risk is always there, and the camps are overcrowded. So I'd be very interested, particularly the panellists who have first-hand insights in, you know, what do aside from the broader legal and accountability issues, what should and can be done very quickly to alleviate the pressures and the issues that are festering in these camps, and I think attendant issues like education, a generation of young kids growing up in the camps with no education or very little, etc. Yes, Shanazi.
Before we take questions, I just want to say something regarding what my friend Fiona said. She mentioned that the Bangladeshi official who was the head of Bangladesh's Rohingya Relief Agency, he was transferred from Cox's Bazar to some other place. I don't know why she portrayed it in a negative way. That person is a government official, and as per rule, every government official is transferred from one place to another place. It has nothing to do with the, this Rohingya program. To the Ministry of Jute. It's a better place than Cox's Bazar, I can tell you. You see, in the last 8 years, not a promotion, but it's a better place. In the last 8 years, I have been transferred 6 times, okay? This is my 5th posting from ministry. Yeah, I have worked in 6 places. So it does not mean that I have been punished or something. This is normal, it's a regular transfer. Secondly, she mentioned that Bangladesh has migrant workers, overseas workers, 1 million. I don't know why she compared the number with the refugees. I mean, migrant workers are not refugees. They are workers. They are working legally. And
it was just when you were talking about population.
No, population.
The crowded population.
You see, Philippines have 11 million overseas workers. So if Malaysia sends 11 million people, you cannot justify that. I mean, don't compare our migrant workers with the forcibly, displaced people. They are refugees, and I don't know why this comparison. Thank you.
Okay, I think actually that broader point was actually about the economy of Bangladesh and what's sustainable, actually.
Yeah, and that,
Sorry,
No. Just because our people are working legally somewhere and sending 15 billion US dollar per year, that does not justify, that does not mean that we will give permission, we will give shelter and permission to work to these Rohingya peoples. We have our own rules and regulations, and we have given shelter. We are trying our best to help these people, but we don't want anybody to compare our migrant workers with the displaced people from Myanmar. I mean, they are in a very bad situation. We should not compare these. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Fiona, you can come back to it later if you want. If we could just take a question, unless you have some. Yes, we've got a couple. No, if you'd like to say something, and then we've got a couple of people waiting. But
I was just going to quickly reply to your question about the situation in the camps, how people are feeling about what they need right now. I just think education, education, education. We've done some research earlier this year on the way that community members are trying to provide education to their own children in the camps because it's been such a delay in formal education programming. And they made these really poignant quotes when we interviewed them that the short-term genocide was what happened to them in Myanmar, but they feared for the overall death of their culture, like the real destruction of their people will come from a lost generation of children. So they're sadly so used to not having rights that they're not making huge demands about the situation sometimes in Bangladesh, but the one thing that everyone is really, really, really concerned and in despair about is this education question.
Yeah, and I think just to echo that, early on there was some studies done on youth mental health, and the figures came up at that point that 5% of youth were reporting suicidal thoughts or death thoughts, which is a really high number, and the conditions haven't got any better. So
yeah, and we also in our host community research, the host community also was really urging for education in the camps, because they said they're also afraid of what will become of a lost generation of Rohingya children.
Right, which breeds its own social ills. But anyway, if you're okay, guys, can we just continue on with questions? Yes, please identify yourself and.
Person, SIL International, and actually that's a perfect segue because I wanted to hear more. You mentioned there are over 1,000 non-formal learning centers. So I was curious specifically, what curriculum are they using? Bangladeshi, Burmese, Canadian? What languages are being used for that, and where are the teachers coming from?
Well, there is no reason for us to teach them Bangladeshi language and Bangladeshi curriculum, because they are foreigners, and we gave them shelter temporarily, and they will go back to their own country. We are not, preparing the kids to be, to stay put in our country. So the 1,200, at least 1,200 schools or learning centers are there. They are trying to follow Myanmar curriculum, but the problem is the language. They are not being able to teach their language to these children because they are not getting enough teachers. So mostly the teachers are volunteers, and those schools or learning centers are being operated by mainly UNICEF and also international NGOs, and also Bangladesh NGOs like BRAC. Yeah.
And just to add to that, refugees strongly advocate for using the Myanmar curriculum because their children have been cut off midway through their studies. So they're quite strongly advocating for the use of the Myanmar curriculum, and there are also a decent number of Rohingya in the camps who were teachers in Myanmar and are used to teaching that curriculum. There are logistical challenges related to how to provide education to over 400,000 school-aged children and youth, but Rohingya feel that they can largely, fill that gap. We heard that on the Myanmar side, the Myanmar government denied permission for its curriculum to be used in the camps, and that there's ongoing advocacy by the UN, maybe UNICEF on that point. I don't know the details, but apparently that's one thing that's holding it up. And in lieu of having access or formal permission to use the Myanmar curriculum, there has been a learning curriculum framework drafted trying to parallel the Myanmar curriculum in terms of learning goals. But it's a framework that then agencies can develop their own proprietary curriculums to fulfill. And refugees usually aren't happy with that because it's kind of scattered. It feels like, oh, BRAC's doing one thing, Save the Children's doing another thing, and they want something standardized and formalized. It's really important to them.
But no education in their mother tongue then?
Well, yeah,
they're afraid of using their language and culture.
Rohingya would be a medium of instruction if the Myanmar curriculum were taught by Rohingya teachers. I've observed quite a few community-led education sessions in the camps, and a lot of time the teachers are actually speaking the Rakhine language because that was what they were used to teaching in the schools in Rakhine State. But yeah, they definitely want to teach in the mother tongue, but the Myanmar curriculum. So Burmese, and then there's also English lessons that are part of the Myanmar curriculum at the higher grades.
Paul Waddell, a writer and former journalist. No one has talked at all about what is happening inside Burma itself. why were these expulsions occurring so recently, if it's been such a long problem? What interaction is there between the Rohingya issues and the political changes that are going on inside Burma? However limited and difficult they may be, how it may be less effective on the ground than it seems, and in particular, how would the accountability, the international accountability mechanisms that you've described, how might they interact with the ongoing political process in Burma to maybe change the situation that right now looks so bleak?
Well, I think first, Jonathan, you can kick off on that one. Kingsley,
I'll say as much as I can. I mean, as we know, the issue about the marginalization of the Rohingya goes back a long way, particularly if you look at the 1982 citizenship law, which then categorized 135 races and excluded them. You could argue that negative attitudes towards them go back further than that. But many people will highlight the evolution of a sort of more competitive democratic environment after the 2010 election, when people sensed that change was coming. And in Rakhine, these issues between the Rakhine Buddhists and the Rohingya Muslim population, which are deep-rooted, go back a very long way, made the Rakhine population very, very nervous. Everyone was worried about who's going to get what power under the new system. And as it happened, after the 2010 election, the Rakhine Party, the RNDP, was one of the larger parties in parliament, apart from the pro-military party, the USDP, and of course eventually the NLD when they joined it. And that heated up politics, and we know that. You know, the RNDP was pushing for a much more aggressive form of Rakhine Buddhist nationalism and much more concerned about where they stood in relation to Muslims. And as we saw, that then erupted in two bouts of communal violence in June and October of 2012, where the RNDP politicians were accused of stirring up an already very volatile situation. And we had a couple of incidents that sparked it off. We also saw the wholesale purging of the Muslim population, for example, well outside the current conflict area in Chaopyu, which is where the current Chinese gas terminal is. Very big economic opportunity. There was a big non-Rohingya Kaman Muslim population there that was pretty much expelled en masse in October of 2012. And I was in Rakhine State, seeing that they're all displaced. They've all ended up in the Rohingya areas in the camps with Rohingyas. In fact, I've met a lot of Rohingyas who actually have Kaman. Kaman are recognized as an ethnic race, but because they're Muslim, they're condemned to be Rohingyas and don't get their full national identity card or recognition. It's a very complicated situation in a sense. If you look back at what happened in Indonesia after the fall of Suharto, we saw at the end of a dictatorship, the ethnic conflict broke out because everybody realized they now had to compete. It wasn't going to be decided for them for power, and that aligned itself often along different ethnic groups. To some degree, I think there was an extreme version of that in Rakhine. What's interesting is the way in which the Burmese armed forces, which claims to be a force for unity in the country, has aligned itself so firmly with one side in Rakhine. And if you listen to majority Burma talk about Rakhine, the Rakhine see themselves as the original Buddhist kingdom, even before the great Buddhist kingdoms of the 17th, 18th century in Burma, and see themselves as sort of betrayed and conquered by Burma in the late 18th century. There's very bitter feelings. Burmese will often say, if you see a snake in a Rakhine, you kill the Rakhine first. It's odd that the interest in the Burmese military chose to side with the Rakhine against the Muslims, who are the ultimate outsiders in their view. I think that's been accentuated under the command of Min Aung Hlaing. He's clearly, if you look at his comments, aligned himself very strongly with the hardline nationalist view that Rakhine share of the Muslims as having deliberately swamped parts of Rakhine State and of being complete outsiders. And it's played into a much more liberal media atmosphere where the media has actually accentuated it, particularly on social media, and in the competitive political environment where, for example, in the 2015 election, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, keen to get a majority, was so nervous of the anti-Muslim sentiment they wouldn't have any Muslim candidates, and Suu Kyi herself, going right back to 2012, refused point blank to raise the issue of Rohingyas in Rakhine State because she said, oh, it's too sensitive, too complicated. I can't, in effect, the way she said it, told me this herself, cannot squander my moral stature on an issue as complex as that. It's a very, very complex problem. It's been building for a long time. I think, though, if you look at the comments made by Min Aung Hlaing in 2017, it was clear when we looked at the camps in 2012, the miserable conditions they were living in, and then when I went back in 2013 and saw them, nothing moving, nothing changing, I went with a British minister who was actually inclined to be sympathetic to the Burmese government, and then having seen it, described it as like apartheid. And he went into Ongmingala in Sittwe and said, this is like Gaza, it's a ghetto. I mean, those conditions, we looked at those. There are a lot of Rohingya men who've been to the Middle East, got contacts in Saudi Arabia. We all said it's only a matter of time before these overpressured, marginalized young men who've only got Islam in their lives turn to jihadism. When ARSA appeared, seemingly out of nowhere in October of 2016, it seemed to catch the Burmese military by surprise, and they attacked a number of posts. As a result, the military operation reacting to them, shocked that for the first time in decades Rohingyas have fought back, drove 87,000 people out of the country. On the very day that the attacks happened on the 25th of August, we heard about them. When they said there were 30 posts that were attacked, far more than in 2016, everyone knew what was coming. At that point, I think the Burmese military made a decision to sort this out for good. Exactly what Min Aung Hlaing said, it was a sort of final solution, drive them out to Bangladesh. But it's been building for a very, very long time.
And yeah, I would just add that I think a lot of what you're saying there is accurate, but I think it's important to note that prior to the attacks in 2016, and certainly prior to the attacks in 2017, there was already a big build-up of Myanmar military presence in northern Rakhine. So, which came first,
I think in 2017 there's clear evidence the military knew what was coming,
yeah,
was ready for it.
Yeah, or by putting a lot of pressure in areas that it was engendering a situation where something like that was going to come. I don't think it was just a situation in which it was a knee-jerk reaction in either case.
In the build-up to 2017, one of the interesting things, I remember in Bangladesh talking to the Hindu population that had fled, and they said they were picked on by the Muslim population because the Rohingyas militants saw them as acting as agents, and they said the reason for that was because after 2016 ARSA became much more active. We met a lot of ARSA activists of some kind, some of them might have been senior, maybe not, in Bangladesh, who described how they were recruited, how they went up into the hills, trained in very basic bomb making. They were supported often by the imam. Only certain villages, and I suspect those are the villages that were targeted in particular by the Burmese military in August of 2017. But ARSA knew about this, and they started targeting people they believed in the Muslim community who were informers to the Burmese military. And we had, I think, 60 or 70 Muslims killed, but believed to be killed by ARSA, trying to wipe out people who were informing on them. And it's thought the military then turned to the Hindu population, who often lived side by side with the Muslim population, to be their informers. The Hindus then became objects of suspicion for us militants as potential informers. I think that build-up was happening well before August of 2017.
All right, thank you.
And then,
go on, 30 seconds.
Well, I was going to ask the second part to the question, which I think was, how should Myanmar interact or not interact with these accountability process given the political situation at the moment? And by the political situation at the moment, I think you're perhaps referring to, Myanmar's recent transition to democracy and the opening up of the country and that kind of thing. It's an excellent question. I think the first point to reiterate is that the primary obligation to assure accountability rests with Myanmar itself. So it should be conducting investigations and prosecutions where appropriate. And if it were to do so, there would be no need for any of these international accountability mechanisms. The second is that these mechanisms are independent and impartial. And if you look at, say, the International Criminal Court, if it moves to a full investigation, and the IIMM, they will be entering their investigations with an open mind and no preconceived notions as to which individuals may or may not be responsible, and they're looking at individual criminal responsibility. They're not looking at whether Myanmar itself as a country is responsible for crimes or not. And so, given their independence and their lack of prejudgment, they may very, very well be looking for cooperation from Myanmar for access to the country. We have yet to see, and Myanmar should cooperate with those mechanisms. It's very much in their interest to do so, but cooperation hasn't yet been forthcoming. But I think another point that's important to make, which sometimes comes up during these discussions, and it's come up in similar discussions I've had in different continents around the world, which is the notion that, you know, the political situation is too delicate at the moment, that efforts at accountability is counterproductive. And this was the prevailing view 20, 30 years ago. It was considered by the United Nations and others that sort of impunity or amnesties or immunities was the necessary price to pay for a transition to peace, a transition to democracy, for the country to move forward. But experience around the world, particularly in Latin America, has been very much the contrary, actually. And it is now, you know, written into international law and standards in the last 20 years that accountability is actually necessary. It's a necessary precondition for establishing respect for the rule of law in a country and not contempt for the rule of law, as often happens when there's a culture of impunities and amnesties, which often generally means that there won't be investigations, there won't be prosecutions. Accountability is also necessary to address different grievances in society, so the cycle doesn't go round and around and around. And we've seen that in certain countries around the world, including in Latin America, where people thought that certain conflicts had been resolved through amnesties and impunity and this kind of thing, not pushing for accountability at the early stage, but they've cycled back round again, sometimes with the same actors involved. Accountability is also important for its deterrence effect. Otherwise, perpetrators of serious human rights violations think they can get away with doing it over and over and over and over and over again. And that also has the effect of grievances and resentment growing and growing within a society and never being addressed. So this idea of a situation is too delicate for investigations and prosecutions was debunked some time ago, and that in order to aid reconciliation within a society, respect for human rights and the rule of law, democracy, accountability is necessary. Investigations should immediately follow allegations of violations, and so should prosecutions in appropriate cases where perpetrators have been identified.
But specifically in the case of Myanmar, is there any sign that political actors are concerned that they might be called to account, or that others in their government might be called to account and therefore would be more willing to address some of these problems? Is there any sign of that?
There is some, isn't there? I mean, the only thing I would say is that the Myanmar government has just, out of the blue, announced an investigation into a massacre that was exposed by the Associated Press 18 months ago, to which at the time the Myanmar government responded by saying it was a lie and insisted they should apologize. They're now saying there's a genuine case for investigation. That doesn't come out of nowhere. There is pressure on the Myanmar military. The very fact they allowed me to go on this trip to Rakhine State when we've been blacklisted tells me they recognize they need to be seen to be cooperative to some degree. The other fact, which I'm sure Kingsley will understand just as well, is that how dysfunctional the Myanmar government is, that is so dependent, when it's ruled by the National League for Democracy, on a woman who has kind of shut herself up in the castle and doesn't basically put her fingers in her ears and doesn't want to hear about it.
Well, I also think, if I may contribute, the timing of the General Assembly in New York coming up very soon, and also there are threats of sanctions, so the EU, along with hitting Cambodia with threats, has also mentioned Myanmar and put it on the same kind of timeline notice of improvement by the end of the year. So I think that's also, and this whole media thing, it's not just Jonathan, they're doing a series of tours. So Hannah Beach of the New York Times wrote a very powerful piece early this week, and it was a similar tour where they you know, I don't know what they think they're achieving by it, because, you know, taking journalists to areas where Rohingya villages have been bulldozed and then expecting to get positive responses on that seems to be a bit off beam, but then that would be not surprising from the government. But, you know, it's those sort of things. So I'd say it's a number of factors, but I think the timing right now is that they're very worried about General Assembly. Sheikh Hasina, I think, is going to give a big address on the issues, and various others, and this accountability issue is bubbling up. So, and also the military is very peeved that, you know, they've been named by the US, and Min Aung Hlaing, the top commander, has been named now at long last. It took a very long time for him to be fingered, but he's pissed off. He can't even, you know, he can't travel anymore to Western countries. So I think something has led them to believe that if they look like they're opening up a bit more, or appearing to look more responsive, maybe some good will come of that. Am I right? I think that's an element as well. Michael.
Thank you. Michael Mackey, freelance. Just a question for Jessica, if I may, although I'm sure the other panellists will butt in if they feel they've got something they have to say. Are you noticing a hardening of attitudes in the camps towards Myanmar? I mean, is this a situation that, if it's not dealt with sooner, will ossify and become, as Jonathan said, this an activated Islamist jihadist situation? Thank you.
Well, I suppose that, you know, everyone in the camps will tell you that they want perpetrators to be held accountable. You know, they want justice, they want their rights back, and they, you know, definitely identify the Myanmar government and military as, you know, the oppressor. I don't think that there's a link between that and some kind of jihad Islamist thing. We don't see any link to any sort of radicalization. It's not something that I've ever come across. You know, you definitely, you know, ARSA is definitely a reality. They have a presence. But there is not anything in terms of Islamist rhetoric. We don't really see that. You know, I mean, I think ARSA gets put in a totally separate box than other Myanmar armed groups, which are just kind of assumed to have the right to exist. And I mean, functionally, we don't see any significant difference between the way ARSA has.
Is not a jihadist group, is it?
No, not at all. No, it's not a jihadist group at all. The kind of nationalism you see with the Rohingya kind of political voice is very similar to what you'd see in other Myanmar ethnic groups. So no, I don't see any sign of radicalization in the camps at all. I think it's a very conservative population, but we have to be very careful to always distinguish conservatism, fundamentalism, extremism, radicalization. These are all very separate categories.
I think my point, Michael, was that that's what we thought would happen. ARSA was not jihadist, it was nationalist, but we were expecting some kind of violent reaction at some point.
I'd also just like to slip in one other question which hasn't really come up. I think you touched sort of tangentially on it, Jonathan, which is that, you know, the real focus for the military now in Rakhine is the Arakan army. And we're seeing, I mean, that's a steadily brewing, I think, major human rights situation as well, because there's a lot of repression going on at the grassroots level in villages that are now, I mean, they're completely aimed at Rakhine Buddhists, so it's Buddhists against Buddhists, and therefore it's seen as quite a separate issue. I'm not saying there's a direct link with Rohingya, but I think given the heightened paranoia of the Myanmar military and their hostility, and also some recent attacks that were not necessarily, I think Arakan Army was part of those attacks, a series of attacks recently, including on the military academy. It all mounts up to more tension, fear and paranoia in Rakhine State. So do you think in that respect there is the Arakan Army issue is complicating the issue of repatriation of Rohingya at this point?
I would say, I mean, what was interesting being in Mongdor, which is the one part of northern Rakhine State that has not been affected. There have been no Arakan Army attacks there, but the mountains that run down and separate Mongdor from Butidong and Ratadong are not that high, and the villages that we visited south of Mongdor all the people there talked about hearing artillery every single day on the other side of the mountains. There's a very, very active conflict going on. I mean, the Arakan army have firepower that, you know, puts ASA into a different league. They're very well funded. They've been involved, we assume, in the very substantial methamphetamine drug trade over the border into Bangladesh. And you know, they're very, very well armed. And yeah, I think it's a very significant problem. And it massively complicates things. Also, what struck me in this 3-day visit was how incredibly militarized northern Rakhine State is. The number of fortified barracks you see on the road is staggering. You know, the number of massive police posts, sandbags everywhere. This is an utterly militarized area. You cannot imagine a population that suffered such dreadful abuses at the hands of the border guard police being willing to come back to a place where you just can't move without running into an armed border guard policeman.
Right.
And you know, I hear from families in the camp quite often that they have relatives remaining in Rakhine State who still want to flee to Bangladesh because of all the fighting with the Arakan army, and they are trapped because they can no longer access the border to make the trip across. So it's another example of why talking about repatriation is really tone deaf, given that reality. I mean, civilian protection has to be a red line.
Right. Thank you. Okay, final question. Sir, please identify yourself.
Yes, this is Haji Ismail, a Rohingya from Arakan. My native town is Butidong. I would like to share a little thing, very easy for to understand. Genocide, genocide, and genocide. Genocide plan program on Rohingya is still running on. Yesterday night, I come back from southern Thailand. Our brothers and sisters are still fleeing from Arakan to Malaysia. I interviewed them and I asked all of them, why you are coming again? The government planning for repatriation plan program on Rohingya. Everything is peace on our homeland. But they reply me that from 2012 until today, the plan program of the Burmese army government is still running on. So we need to flee from Arakan to Malaysia. So please stop the repatriation plan program of the Rohingya. If we go back, anybody sending back from Bangladesh to Arakan, direct way or indirect way, who will be give us the protection or life safety? Please stop the plan program of repatriation. This Arakan is like a hell. Please stop the plan program of repatriation. This time is not enough for go back or the send back or the repatriation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Would anyone like to?
Thank you.
We understand the situation in Rakhine and we understand how the Rohingya brothers and sisters feel, and that is why we are not using any force, or we are not sending them back by force, and we want them to go back voluntarily with dignity when the situation is better and the problem is solved permanently. Thank you.
I means not to Bangladesh. We Rohingya many thanks to Bangladesh government. If Bangladesh government not help us from 2017, we will die many, how many we cannot say. Very thank you on to Bangladesh government, and many thanks for your hospitality. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to just add one small thing for somebody who's just travelled the length and breadth, at least of Mongdor, is that, you know, that part of Rakhine State is staggeringly beautiful. It is undeveloped, it's untouched. It's also almost completely empty. It's just incredible how much of it you drive through where there's nobody there. I mean, it really is a lost opportunity. It's tragic what's happening when you think what the potential of that place could be.
Well, particularly ironic that they've all ended up in this overcrowded country next door. And I do agree. I think Bangladesh deserves a lot of praise. I think the criticisms are just within the broader context of putting it all in perspective, but I think the world should feel quite grateful to Bangladesh for its patience, tolerance, and accommodation of the Rohingya. On that happy note, I would like to thank our excellent panellists for giving us, I think, a really good first-rate look at the situation. And thank you very much to all. And thank you for coming tonight. Don't forget about the upcoming programs too. And I'm sure if you have follow-up questions, our panellists will be around for a little while. Jessica, I think you're taking off for the airport fairly soon, so thank you very much for making the time to come tonight as well. Goodbye. Thank you. I'd forgotten.